Well, hello everyone. So we're ready to start today's webinar. I'm John Peelan. I'm the Director of the Scottish Council of Archives. We still have a few people waiting in the lobby to join, so we're just going to let them in. Okay, well, welcome to today's event, Documenting COVID, Capturing History as it Happens. We have three speakers today. Jill Mapstone, who's Head of Archives and Records Engagement with the National Records of Scotland, and Laura Gould, Government Records Archivist, and Frank Rankin, Information Government Consultant. How we're going to run today's event is we'll have presentations and we'll also give you the opportunity at the end to ask questions. You can do that using the chat box and then also by using the raise hand symbol. We'll be monitoring the questions, and if you have a question directed at a particular speaker, please say so in your question. Also, we have a Mentimeter, which hopefully most of you will be familiar with now. We're running a poll during the session. There's a screen up now which gives the code. If you don't have Mentimeter on your phone, please take a few minutes, actually it only takes seconds to download it. And the code there is 507946. So I'm just going to admit a few more people to the event and we'll start. So first up, welcome our first speaker, Jill Mapstone. I'll hand over to you, Jill.
Hi there. Hi. Yeah, Jill Mapstone here. Head of Records and Archives Engagement at the National Records of Scotland. Hopefully you're seeing my slides now. Yeah, that should be grand. Documenting COVID, the purpose of this webinar today. The global health crisis that we face this year has impacted on all organisations, changed the way we work, and for many, seen the delivery of new services and functions using new technologies. The decisions and actions that are taken during this time will be the subject of great interest in the short, medium and the long term as politicians, the organisations, authorities are held to account by the media, by potential public inquiries, and in the very long term by historians and researchers. The information which documents these actions and decisions are critically important to understanding this period of emergent history we are currently living through. So today we want to explore further with you the challenges and opportunities, great phrase, around capturing and documenting these responses through the management and selection of records of enduring value. I'm going to flag up right now, this is a participatory event, although we do have two other terrific presenters who are going to share their experience and ideas and thoughts about it. Today really is about beginning a conversation, and it's essential we hear from you all throughout this event. So a bit of background. As mentioned, I'm Head of Records and Archives Engagement at NRS, and part of what I'm responsible for is the implementation of the Public Records Scotland Act. This legislation's been in operation since 2013, and it requires named public authorities in Scotland to put in place plans to manage the public records that they create and use. So the PRSA team who work with me are really interested to ensure the proper management of public records and the archiving of those records that have an enduring value. Another part of my role, though, is about archive strategy and liaison across Scotland and across all sectors. Obviously, the Public Records Scotland Act is about the public sector, but we engage in NRS with archives across the public and private sector all across the country. So in March and April this year, it became increasingly of interest to myself, to my teams and wider NRS indeed, to understand how public authorities were responding to this challenge of records management and archiving in response to COVID. So along with pretty much everybody else in April, we sent out a survey to our stakeholder community in the Public Records Scotland Act partners. to try and understand the changes to their working arrangements and the role that records and information management have played in supporting those changes. Over 70 authorities responded to our survey, which is about 1/3 of our stakeholder community, and there were some sort of key findings which are in that little pyramid there. Top of the list, digital. Access to reliable digital records and information is essential to supporting the transition to remote working arrangements. That's kind of obvious and self-explanatory, but not everybody does have access to reliable digital records and information. And more interestingly as well, the COVID response is primarily a born digital record as well. So that's something we need to think about. Resource and impact was the other key message. 20% of our respondents reported to us that they had had significant adjustments to their roles, responsibilities, and their records management and information governance activities in order to support the delivery of key services within their organisations responding to the COVID emergency. In addition to this, staff isolation, communication limitations, caring responsibilities, all these things have reduced capacity across the sector, and there's concern for the longer term implications about this. At the time of the survey, 81% of our respondents told us that there was widespread cessation of records and information management development work. And there's a real concern there about what that means long term. There's some really good things though, and records management business continuity planning, which is a key part of the requirements of the Public Records Scotland Act, has been vital to this transformation in working arrangements, and it's been successful. 95% of the business continuity information management plans have stood up to the challenge and the demands made on them. But what about retention and documentation? So in the survey, we asked this question. As we're living through emerging history, what changes, if any, have you made to your retention disposal plans? And the answers to that question are a significant reason why we're having this event today. Again, I mean, this survey happened in April, so we have to bear that in mind. But at that point, 100% of our respondents had not yet formally considered or adapted their retention and disposal schedules or their selection criteria to ensure the preservation of records of significant importance relating to COVID are captured for archiving purposes. So remember, these are public bodies creating public records, and there's a substantial risk that some of this information will be lost if that is not addressed. Also, as you'll see from the little speech bubbles there, people really wanted to have some advice, some help, have a conversation about this. So that's why we brought people together today to have a think about some of these questions that are on the screen now. And this is the right audience for that conversation. It's great to see such a diverse audience of people, you know, within Scotland, beyond Scotland, private sector, public sector, and that's terrific. That's what we're looking for. But also really pleased to see that we've got archivists, we've got knowledge managers, we've got data protection specialists, records managers, and everybody has something to offer. So again, I'm just going to say we really do want to have that conversation today and get to really understanding where the challenge lies. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Laura Gould from another part of NRS, and she's going to share her experiences over the last little while and start the conversation there.
Okay, thanks very much, Jill. I'm just going to share my slides. All right, hopefully everybody can see these slides. So I'm Laura Gould. I'm one of the government records archivists at the National Records of Scotland. And our section works with government bodies and public authorities to help them decide which of their records they should deposit with us under element 7 of their records management plan. And my clients are some of those who have been really at the forefront of the pandemic, the NHS Special Health Boards, the Care Inspectorate, and some of the education bodies. So I'm just going to share with you some of the things that we've been doing over the last 5 or 6 months to take a look at what new records are being created at the moment by these public bodies and how we can help to identify them and ensure that records of enduring value are selected for permanent preservation. So the first thing that we've been doing is to set the framework for selecting these records of enduring value. So in line with the International Council and Archives statement, we've added our voice to those in the sector, stressing the need to document the crisis. And so we've changed our collecting policy to explicitly mention that the records created during COVID-19 are now one of our collecting themes. And this indicates to our depositors our commitment to document Scotland's response to the pandemic and to help them identify records worthy of permanent preservation. Now, in drawing attention to this, we recognise absolutely that there are many competing operational demands at the moment, but we note that at this point in time when the records are being created, and whilst the people who created them are still in post, it's the best time to start thinking about managing them. You'll see that the collecting policy there is purposely broad, and that's to encompass the wide range of functions that all of these public authorities and government bodies perform. So the second thing that we've been doing is to start conversations with our depositors. And this is really to help them narrow down their focus on selecting records of enduring value. So we've really been asking 3 key questions. Firstly, whether new records are indeed being created. Secondly, where are these being stored? And thirdly, how will records of enduring value be identified and transferred to archive? So we've started off by talking to them about the functions that are being performed at the moment. Are new functions being performed? Are pre-existing functions being done differently to before? Have new teams of staff been created to deal with the demands that they have at the moment? And are staff working in different ways? Is there new technology for them to work with? So what we're seeing is absolutely, some of our depositors do have new functions. There's new COVID-19 testing taking place. There's new systems of exam results. There are new daily briefings to the public. And all of our depositors are now carrying out their existing functions differently. For example, many are interacting with stakeholders online rather than face-to-face. And then for those with frontline staff who are still working directly with the public, they're working differently. There's new equipment, so there's new procedures for all of this. Yes, we see that new teams have been created to deal with these demands, and also that many organisations have now switched to platforms such as Microsoft Teams. Some of these have only switched over since lockdown began, so it's a very short period of time. Or if they were using this technology beforehand, they've now become increasingly reliant on it. And so we recognise that potentially important decisions and procedural changes are now being stored on these platforms. So all of our depositors are now creating new records, some of which will be of enduring value, and that raises more questions for us about the management of them and the selection of them. So first of all, where are these records being stored? Are records managers able to access these records? How is retention being applied to them? Do business classification schemes need to be updated to incorporate them? Who is managing these records, and who's going to review them and when for selection for archive? So it's still very much an emerging picture, but we're seeing 2 key approaches emerging at the moment. And both of these present opportunities and challenges for us as archivists when we're thinking about appraisal. So the first of these approaches is a kind of centralised approach where all of the COVID-19 records are being ring-fenced in one area, regardless of the department that creates them. This has often been within the business continuity area of records management systems, and then it's often subdivided within that, for example, into board papers, communications. The second approach that we're seeing is where records are stored on an electronic records and document management system, but these are being saved within the normal work areas according to the departments who create them, and then they may well be subdivided within that again into communications, research, legislation. These records are being given specific COVID-19 file names, and they're being labelled and tracked with normal retention applied to them. So in terms of the first approach, there are certainly benefits to this, where there is a central team managing an organisation's COVID-19 response, and they're also managing the associated records. There's a consistency of approach, all of these records are in one place. So potentially there's one neat folder of records for us to appraise at some point in the future. The challenges with this, though, are, I wonder if this is pushing decisions down the line. What is going to be the retention trigger for these records? Who is going to continue to manage and appraise them? And it raises the question for us, which is not unique to COVID, but as Jill mentioned, the majority of these records are born digital records. So when we're talking about potentially big numbers of records, it seems unlikely that a kind of individual file level appraisal is going to be possible. So we're talking about macro appraisal for these. In terms of the second approach, the benefits of this are that the records should be properly labelled, they should be set for appropriate retention. This should make in-house appraisal easier, and we're going to be dealing with smaller batches of records at a time. On the other hand, there are challenges with this around consistency. Individuals and teams may well use different file naming conventions. They may approach appraisal differently. And of course, there's always the element of human error. So what if the incorrect retention is applied and critical documents are permanently deleted? I've mentioned that these are the kind of two key approaches that we're seeing. This doesn't represent every single organization, of course. There are challenges out there which really reflect the reality of the situation before COVID-19 struck. Some of these are related to the level of resourcing that's given over to records management. Some organizations have very long established records management in place. Others have only had a records manager in post for a very short period of time. We've seen some organizations since COVID started being able to get involved. The records managers have been able to get involved with the decision making around the creation of records right from the start, thinking about the storage of them, thinking about the tracking of them, thinking about permanent preservation. Other organizations have been sending out, for example, new file naming conventions to all staff. But there are other organizations for whom this level of resource is just not possible. And then we're also, again, talking about different technologies. As I've mentioned, many organizations are using electronic records document management systems. Others are still using a shared drive system. Records managers are certainly aware that some people might be saving documents to their personal drives. And then, of course, there will still be some paper files out there, particularly for some of the frontline staff. So I just wanted to share some kind of final thoughts for our discussion about some of the challenges and the opportunities that we're facing at the moment. I think one of the key challenges is coming from the fact that there's been a very rapid change of functions for many organizations and the take-up of new technologies to go along with this. And I wonder if records management policies are able to keep pace with this. Secondly, time is a big factor for everyone. Jill mentioned the reduced capacity that most organizations are working under. This does obviously impact on the records, who's able to manage them, who's able to review them, and when they're able to do this. And of course, it's still a very changeable situation. We're already seeing a move from the initial response to a new normal. And the new normal means that functions of many organizations are still different from before. And so the records are different as well. On the other hand, I certainly see many opportunities for us. It's certainly giving us a fresh impetus to speak to depositors very early on at the start of the record creation and management process. We're also seeing that many organizations who use their website as one of the key ways to communicate with the public have decided to take up the NRS web archiving service. Quite a number of our government records clients were already using this, but many more have signed up recently and had their web archive added to the COVID-19 web archive that our colleagues in the digital records unit have set up. And finally, it's a chance for us as a sector to look more closely at some of these emerging technologies and think about how we seek to select records of enduring value from them. That was the main points I wanted to make. I've just put up our government records collecting policy link there as well for anybody who'd like to take a look at that.
Okay, so this sort of section of this afternoon's event is really to try and get some information from you all about your experience in this particular space. Hopefully you were all able to log on to Menti using another device, a phone or some such thing. And we would really like to get some feedback here. Oh, great, people are voting. It's like Eurovision, it's very exciting. So the first thing we're wanting to know about there are there new types of records being created in your organisation to support new functions and activities to deal with COVID? I mean, is this a problem or have we made it up? And so if you could do that, we'll keep that up for about 30 seconds or so, just so we can try and get some feedback. Frank and Laura, feel free to throw in any of your thoughts in this as well, whilst people are voting.
Yeah, this is really good to see. It's kind of how I expected. Lots of people reporting new functions, new records.
And please do use the chat function on Teams if you'd be happy to share with us about what those new functions and activities are, and if they're different from what you've been, if they're significantly different from what your organisation has been doing in the past, and therefore is that a challenge for you in terms of your records management, your archival selection? So yeah, this is the participatory bit, folks. So we need to hear from you, please. But we have a number of questions, so we'll just keep this question up for maybe another 15 seconds, Robert, and then we can maybe move on to the next one. Yeah, sorry, Craig, the code is at the top of your screen there. It's 507946, but I did exactly the same thing in the rehearsal, so it's only the cool kids that miss that. So if you just put that code in, you should be able to participate. Okay, so that's interesting. Nobody's saying no. So some people are unsure, but there's a bunch of people who are sure that they are doing new things and new records. So that's really interesting. Perhaps if we could move on to the next question. Here we are. What are these? Now you can just put in a free text thing in here, and it'll appear on the screen. What are these new functions? What are these new records? Are you having to adapt your business classification schemes? Teams, yes, the rapid rollout of Teams. So that's the way that you are creating information. But again, we're interested as well about what these new activities and functions are. Do they have an enduring value? Is one of the questions we're interested in exploring. Biscuit.
That was going to be my question as well.
Chat transcripts from Skype. Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting thing about, how do we capture, these decisions that are being made in different ways, and are the current records management arrangements in operation, the current selection policies, do they meet the needs of this changed environment? What is Biscuit? I have to ask. I guess it's maybe some bespoke sort of system. Okay, we'll just give this another few seconds. SharePoint system, okay. Excellent, thank you, Kay. Wow, okay. So Sarah's just putting on the chat here that one of the main area of new types of records at Edinburgh University is the open call from the archive to the university communities to submit records documenting their experience. Lots of web and social media submissions we haven't collected before. That's interesting as well, isn't it? People are communicating through different media channels than they were, you know, for core business and activity.
Yeah, I think the social media thing is going to be a continuing thing, looking at so much information going out via Twitter, for example. And how we think about starting to collect that is definitely an interesting
yeah, and treating these as the record of activity of organisations, seeing that in a completely different way. Okay, perhaps we could move on to the next question. Do you know where your organisation's new COVID-19 records are? Could you fully find these and access them?
Yeah, I'm really interested to see the response to this one.
Yeah, from an archivist point of view, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, and a records manager's point of view, very much so.
Yeah. They might be of enduring value, but if we don't know where they are, then how are we going to get them? That's good.
Oh, good. There's some
people do know.
Oh, that's terrific. But again, there's still a lot of uncertainty here.
Absolutely. And that really reflects that it's a very changing situation, that it's still a very new situation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the point you touched on before, Laura, about that is one of the challenges, that this is a new and constantly evolving situation. It's not a linear situation either.
Yep.
Lots of steps forward, steps back in all aspects of this, and record keeping will be one part of that.
And I think it's continuing possibly for a lot longer than a lot of us imagined it would do at the start as well. So what had to be short-term measures are now becoming longer-term.
Yes, workarounds.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, is that the same question? Can you?
Well, it's really a question for those people who do know where they are. Can they access them?
Can you access them? No. Right. Gosh, that's very interesting. Would anybody feel comfortable perhaps sharing, either by raising their hand and unmuting, or on the chat, what the barriers are to that access? Is it that you don't know where the information is? Is that the main barrier, or are there other difficulties around technology or communication infrastructure? Really keen to understand that a bit more.
I think from what we're seeing there and the responses, it's not surprising to me at the moment. Lots of these things will probably have kind of operational security perhaps attached to them. Not always records managers can get access to them at the point that they're kind of live records.
And what I should say as well is the feedback you're giving us here, we will take this forward after this event and really sort of give it some more consideration and share the kind of overview with you all. So like I say, this is the beginning of a conversation to try and understand this. Okay, perhaps if we move on to the next question. Has your organisation or your wider sector developed or adapted retention mechanisms to deal with the records associated with COVID? Okay, if for those who have been involved in adapting or developing retention mechanisms, would anybody feel comfortable sharing how that's happened? Has that been something just within your own organisation, or have you worked with peer organisations or looked at updated guidance from anywhere? If anyone would be willing to share that, that would be really good. Or does nothing need changed? we don't need to worry about this. Should say Frank is going to, after we've done this bit, Frank's going to talk about retention mechanisms and the SCARS retention schedules a bit more as well. So we will be looking at that next, but we are really keen to understand, for those of you who have made this shift and have made changes, we're really keen to know how you've done that and what you've used to inform those kind of changes.
I guess another question could be as well, I suspect that because this is still such a new situation, this hasn't been done yet, but maybe if people think this is something that they might now do in the next 6 months or so, that would be quite interesting to find out as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe if we move on to the next question, if that's possible, Robert. So what type of records should we be preserving? What are the records that have an enduring value? How will we understand Scotland's response to COVID? Again, this is a free text thing. So what, in your opinion, as you know, as information managers, as archivists, what is it that we need to be capturing? What do we need to preserve? Particularly, what are the genuinely new types of records that are being created that we should be ensuring make their way to some form of preservation? Records of decision making, and I guess there's an issue there around the platforms as well, that which are where these decisions are made.
Yeah, I think evidence of decision making is going to be one of the key things that we're going to be asked as a sector for in the short to medium term. It's certainly going to be freedom of information requests about this. There's going to be public inquiries about this. So absolutely.
I think that's a really interesting point that's been made there as well, though, about also capturing individuals' experiences. And I know there's been a lot of activity in the archival sector to reach out to people to ask, you know, to proactively document their experiences. Oh, great! There's lots of suggestions coming in here. Personal testimonies of key workers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the impact on different communities is a really important one as well, especially for a national archive to try and get all of those different impacts across.
That's an interesting one as well there, about how services have adjusted and changed and responded to. You made the point earlier there, Laura, about you know, the changes to the arrangements for exams this year. You know, so that's a definite change. And thanks, Louise. I can see in the chat that you're sharing some of your experiences at the university. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think at this stage, Louise, making a wish list is absolutely as much as you can do at this stage. Knowing what you think you want is a good start.
That's a really interesting one that's just come up there. Business resumption planning. That's all our heads are probably in that space to some extent or another at the moment. And that's really interesting about how which services organisations identify as their key activities, you know, that they have prioritised during this period, and then how they go about resuming service as normal, whatever that is, or will it be completely transformed? Is this a really transformative experience, you know, for lots of different organisations? That would be an interesting one. Okay, well, perhaps if we could move on to the next one, please, Robert. So this is here's the records managers versus archivists fight. What do we need to adapt to deal with this particular challenge? Is it retention schedules? Is it archival appraisal? Or is it both of these things?
Nobody's laying it solely at the door of the records managers.
Yeah,
archivists are going to be busy.
It's good to see though that there seems to be shared responsibility.
Absolutely,
I think that is really one of the one of the things about perhaps this is an opportunity for archivists to get more involved in the records management function at an earlier stage than perhaps was the case, and likewise for records managers to be more connected to their archivists, their digital preservation people, as they're dealing with this. Again, if there's any comments or observations anyone would like to give about why they've said this answer, we'd be really keen to see that coming through on the chat as well. Okay, maybe move on to the next question. So what changes or guidance is desired or required to address this problem? What do you people out there think we need to do to not have that information gap, to ensure that our experience as a nation is captured, is documented?
I think you were mentioning there, Jill, it's an opportunity for records managers and archivists to hopefully be more in contact right from the beginning. I think if that's something that we could wave a magic wand and do, that would be a fantastic outcome.
Yeah. And again, another potential issue that's on the horizon is the resourcing long term, and the challenge of meeting that. Consistency and collaboration across organisations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Clear guidance on what local authorities, I take it that to mean, should be keeping in form of the national store. Consistency again there. At the top of the organisation. That is key. That's been something that's been fundamental to the successful implementation of the Public Records Scotland Act. I know that as much, that we have to have a high level person who is committed to records management and making sure records management takes place, and that's been fundamental to enabling the success of our records management colleagues across that community. NRS to ask public bodies to include COVID-19 collecting in their records management plan. That's interesting. Again, if you've got other comments, please, you can put in more than one as well if you've got lots of ideas. A new area within SCARS. Thanks in advance, Frank. Addressed home working. Make sure records are stored in corporate systems, not personal. Yeah,
that's a perennial one, I think.
It becomes more of a challenge though, doesn't it, when
people are working from home? Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a different headspace to be in as well. Hallelujah to that. Seeing that. Not just saving the big shiny things. I like that. It's a common problem, isn't it, for the people at the top to be really into big shiny things. Okay, give us a few more seconds if anyone has any other ideas they want to share, and then perhaps move on to the next question, which is the stinger with that. Who should take the lead on me, you? Okay. Who should take the lead? Is this something that groups of similar authorities and organisations need to be working on together? Should people such as, dare I say it, the National Records of Scotland, the Scottish Council on Archives, the Archives Records Association, the Information Records Management Society, should they be taking the lead? Should they be facilitating? What would that look like? Or should this be something that comes from the ground up? Is that even possible? be interested.
I like that, please.
We could have predicted that, but I do like the please.
Yeah.
And what should that look like as well, you know?
Yeah, I think the comment about adding it to the records management plan from the previous question is an interesting one. Arguably, if as part of element 7, people are making decisions for archive, it should hopefully be included in there as records of enduring value, but actually having it expressed explicitly, I think, is always helpful.
Yeah, the Caldecott Guardians is a good one to yeah, I hadn't considered that, but it's a lot of votes for NRS. We'd win Eurovision, Laura.
Yeah. I think we'd been Eurovision anyway, but
sure. Yeah. With local variations for different organisational types, that's interested.
Yeah, I think we're always talking at a kind of generic level when we're talking about such a large number of big different organisations. So certainly local input is always really useful on the ground.
So perhaps the indication there is the sort of these bodies facilitating a conversation that's particular to particular sectors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super. Okay, if we could go on to the next one, please, Robert, that would be great. What new media are you using to create and manage your records? We're a bit, interested in this. What new channels, new platforms, bespoke systems? How are you capturing video calls, for example, remote meetings, the decision making that takes place in that space? And are you managing all the information that's now being created in digital solutions? Are all your SharePoint sites covered by your records management policies? As you quickly moved to roll out Teams, have you made sure that all those areas are managed and on part of the process?
That's an honest one.
Yeah. And I doubt you're alone.
Yeah.
Be interesting to know if it's a disaster from a record keeping point of view, because often that is the problem, that systems are implemented to deal with a particular business need, but no considerations given to how we get that information out at the end. So is that the disaster that's underpinning that, or is the system just a complete disaster? I'm having a go at web recorder. Managing to make Teams SharePoint just as big a mess as the shared drives. It's a real challenge. We're having to think about records as a completely different thing, like your Keanu Reeves picture, Laura, which is not always a welcome addition to any presentation.
Well, I was a teenager of the 90s, so
but records mean something very different to what they meant, perhaps when people developed their records management plans or their policies some time ago, and made sort of lists or a sense of what the parameters of those policies and plans were, and are they all having to be redrawn now? And from a public record point of view, that is a real challenge. We are very conscious of all the new different methods in which decisions are made in the public sector, and the point that we've made a couple of times, that imperative for that to be captured, to document. The ICA comment that you had in your presentation, Laura, really underlines how important information is, more so during the crisis.
Absolutely, and I think the records management plans that public authorities have to submit every 5 years, sometimes they can be almost out of date before they've been approved. So in this situation, when things are moving so rapidly, it's all the more so that a case that this might be a big issue, that things are just not included But then because of the lack of resource, how many people are there to actually start looking at this wholesale to have a go at including all of these different types of new functions and new forms of recording things?
Yeah,
it's quite a challenge.
And that's a very interesting point. Really seizing on the opportunity that comes with this. And certainly when we did our survey back in April, people did perceive this as an opportunity. There are potential threats. We realise that around funding, around resourcing. But as we've said, just seconds ago, the importance of access to accurate, authentic information is crucial to supporting the different style of working that we're all going through at the moment. And if this can be used as a lever to do that, then that's a really great thing.
Yeah.
Version control is out of the window. Yeah, crikey. Yeah. This is all really, really interesting stuff to hear, and thank you all for sharing this with us. It's really good. Perhaps if we go on to the next one, which I think is maybe our last one. And it's a corker. If a COVID record is born digital, do you have the capacity to preserve this? Oh, great. Somebody does. But,
not surprising. It's still not the case for everybody. In fact, for most people.
And again, any comments on that particular, limitations that you can see there for getting records of enduring value preserved that are born digital? Be really interested to hear your thoughts on that too, again through the chat function. That would be great. I should say as well, all throughout this, you'll have seen I've been going, can we go to the next one, Robert? Can we go to the next one? Robert Wright from the Scottish Council on Archives is doing a fantastic job of driving all this stuff for us today. And so thank you, Robert, for your patience and for doing all this.
Yeah, it was a really good point from Craig there about the difference between what we consider archival preservation and the IT's interpretation of preserve. If it's all on Teams, they think it's all going to be preserved. Whereas what actually makes it to permanent preservation is quite a different thing.
And also the ability to delete from some systems. There's many systems don't allow you to actually delete records, and there's a challenge in that, most definitely from a data protection point of view.
Before the requests come in.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, another optimistic comment there from Vibka about collection is an opportunity. Collecting COVID-19 is an opportunity to start that digital preservation. That's great to hear as well. Okay, well, unless I'm mistaken, Laura, is that the last question from the Menti section?
I believe it is, yep.
Okay, so thank you all for doing that. So Frank Rankin is now going to take over and give us his thoughts on retention scheduling and COVID-19. So I'll go on mute and I'll leave it to you, Frank.
Thank you. Just remember to unmute myself there. So are people seeing my slides just now?
Yeah.
That's great. Smashing. So some interesting points coming through there. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Frank Rankin. A freelance consultant and trainer on information governance type things, and as part of that I have the privilege of working with the Scottish Council on Archives to help maintain and update the Scottish Council on Archives Records Retention Schedule, or SCARS. So for those of you who haven't used that resource, freely available and downloadable from the SCA website, and it's a business classification scheme and records retention schedule based on the functions and activities of local authorities in Scotland, but it's used more widely than that. I think the vast majority of councils in Scotland, but also a lot of other public sector organisations and indeed private and third sector organisations use SCARS as a resource to help identify and derive their own retention schedules. So my interest in this discussion is in how far records retention schedules generally and SCARS in particular can support and contribute to this process of documenting our experiences of COVID. So just to be clear, the SCARS does not originate with the SCA. So it's not that SCARS is an authoritative resource where the Scottish Council and Archives tells authorities what records they should and shouldn't be keeping. Rather, it's a reflection of what our regulatory environment is. So it looks at legislation, we look at that as it changes, we look at what the regulators are saying. And for the majority of record series where there isn't a clear retention schedule, retention period driven by legislation or regulation, then we're reflecting practice in councils. So this, occasionally people come to SCA saying, can you advise us about how long we keep this record? That's not the way SCARS works. SCARS is a community resource reflecting practice. And so I think that that's important to understand in terms of this discussion, how far SCARS can support the documentation of COVID-19, because really it has to reflect what is actually happening out there, particularly in local authorities, but in other types of organisations as well. The structure of SCARS is functional, so it's not based around subjects, it's not based around organisational structures, because obviously that varies from organisation to organisation. So it's very much in function and activity, and it's drawn from pre-existing classification schemes on local government activities. And that's important to bear in mind as well. I was interested to see one of the comments saying it would be useful to see a new area in SCARS to support COVID-19 documentation. I'm struggling to picture what that would look like. Don't want to slap down the idea, but it's difficult to see what that would look like unless there is a substantive change in the functions of local authorities to respond to COVID. The way that SCARS addresses archival preservation at the moment is in two ways. So the majority of record series in SCARS, as you would imagine, have a disposal action of destroy. You know, you come to the end of the retention period, everything in that record series would be securely destroyed. But there are a significant number of record series which are already flagged either as for retention, for permanent retention, or to be reviewed by with the advice of archivists. Now, if there are truly new functions and activities being driven by the COVID response, and those are generating new record series, then we need to identify those and add them to SCARS, or indeed add them to the retention schedule of any organisation that's affected by this. I'm not clear how far that will be the case. I mean, it was interesting to see that in the earlier question, where colleagues were asked whether your organisations were generating new types of records. The overwhelming majority said yes, we are. When it came onto the narrative of those types of records, actually a lot of them, it was really more about form and format and channels. So, you know, there's mention of Teams and Skype and transitioning to SharePoint and things like that. So I think we need to be very clear of the differentiation between, from a records retention point of view, differentiating between what's truly a new record series because of a new activity by an organisation, as opposed to a continuing record series that's now been caught or managed in a different way. Now, clearly that presents particular challenges for how we apply retention rules and how we preserve, but it won't necessarily change the policy position in the retention schedule, if you like. Now, that said, there were clearly some examples there of potentially new functions, new record series around things like the management of shielding, track and trace, and very specific humanitarian responses to COVID. So I'll be very interested, following on from this discussion today, to get specific comments from colleagues where you do see new record series, new functions and activities being documented. It was interesting as well when we went on to discuss what should be retained, because quite a few of the comments were around the types of documents and records which would already be permanently preserved under most retention schedules, SCARs included. So things like senior decision-making processes, policy development, core briefings and guidance to staff. And there were also things which would not sit within classic records management, so personal testimonies of the wider community and of frontline workers. So I wonder as well as the archives and records management response, is there an oral history response that we need to look to here? So yeah, where there are clearly new functions, new activities, that'll be really fascinating to reflect and capture in our retention schedules and students, including SCARs. My sense is there may not be that many truly new functions and truly new record series. My sense is that for the most part, these are different channels, different ways of delivering existing services, but I'm happy to be slapped down if I'm being presumptuous in that. The other possibility, as well as adding record series, is that the retention guidance may change in some existing record series. So there may be some record series and SCARs or any retention schedule where we look again and say, well, no, we think this should be retained or at least reviewed. So that's another possible response from SCARs and for other retention schedules, is we take a second look and identify whether there are any existing series which are just now set at destroy once the retention period is reached. Maybe some of those should be changed to review based on our experiences of COVID. Again, I'd be interested to have specific suggestions from colleagues as to whether any of the record series and SCARs should be changed in that way. So I guess that's my key area of interest is, are we actually seeing new functions, new activities being created in organisations by the COVID response, as opposed to new service delivery channels or new technologies, new ways of doing the same thing? And I'd be interested to hear if anyone has got specific examples, so some examples there of new activities. Be interested to hear if there are any truly new record series out there that we need to reflect in our retention schedules. While I've got the audience, I'm just going to ambush you slightly and ask you to do have a look at the article on SCARs in the latest issue of Broadsheet, because there were the summer 2020 edition, because there are a couple of other key areas where we're keen to have your input on the future of SCARs. So I'll not bore you with them just now, but do please go and have a look and drop us a line with any comments you have. So that's me. I'll be very interested to hear any responses to the thoughts I shared there. Just bring this slide down.
Yeah, so yeah, we just kind of want to open that up now, like Frank said, and keen to hear if anyone be willing to share if they think there are genuinely new functions, genuinely new record types, or is it an issue around new channels like Frank was just mentioning. So if anyone's willing to share, put their hand up, or or on the chat function.
I think Lucy has added a comment there whilst Frank was speaking to say she doesn't think we need a new COVID-19 section, suggesting track and trace records should be added under, say, a management function with 21 days retention.
So that's kind of like what you were just saying there, Frank, about actually just identifying the existing retention mechanisms and attaching these to the new records, understanding how they fit in.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks. That's a good example, Lucy, of is a clear record series that all sorts of organisations are having to generate and capture, and yeah, being clear there is a very short retention period in that one. Can I just ask if what the general view is, if I'm being very simplistic and naive in saying that for the most part, and I know that there are a few new functions and activities being generated, but for the most part, what we are talking about is our organisational responses to COVID, reflecting how we deliver existing services and functions in a new environment.
Craig, yeah, if you could unmute and join in the conversation, that'd be great.
Thanks, Gillian. Hi, Frank. I take your point that there is some confusion between the channels and functions. It doesn't mean we're doing something new because we're doing something which is essentially the old thing but in a new way. But I think there is a fundamental range of new things that we are doing with COVID. I mean, Lucy mentioned the track and trace, and a lot of these things could fit in to the retention schedule, whether that's SCARS or our own individual retention schedules. I'm not saying it needs a whole new section, but there are a whole new range of things that we're doing. I mean, the shielding management thing was a massive thing across all local authorities and other organisations. I struggle to see where that fits in. There's also been a new sort of set of management to cover the function of COVID. We have a COVID response and rejuvenation board, or it's got some awful name like that. But that's new. That doesn't fit in anywhere else as well. So I think it is going to pepper a range of new functions within the retention schedule. It's not just that we're doing the same things differently.
Excellent, that's really useful, Craig. Yeah. In terms of the COVID response board, the management responses, yeah, I'll have a think about where that could sit within SCARS, and clearly a shield management track and trace. I've already got them noted down as candidates for new record series, so might come back to Craig and to Lucy and to anyone else who's willing to give me some time to test out what those records look like, and how we describe those on SCARS.
Great, thanks, Frank.
Cheers, Craig.
I guess that's another question actually that we wanted to explore today. Is there an appetite for that kind of sector, led development, and are people keen to participate in that kind of thing if that was organised by SCA or NRS or whoever, so we're talking there about local authorities. Is that something that people would be really keen to explore? And again, in the higher education sector, do we need to be thinking about that too? Is that the kind of outcome from today that people would welcome? Or I'd be really keen to hear a bit about that. Whilst you think about that, though, Kay's made a comment there about capturing and preserving Zoom and Teams recordings, and has anyone done this? Do you require software to access them that may become obsolete, and does this cause problems for the long-term access in the future? I don't know if anyone's willing to share any experience about that. Or if that's just something that we do need to give some consideration to. It's all very silent. Lucy, I can't hear you if you're trying to say something. And that's a really good question, Louise, and I'd be interested to know if anyone has tackled that in any of the things they've been working on. Again, another good question. Alistair, if you would like to unmute, that'd be great.
Hi. Just a thought. Andrew Warland from Australia did an IRMS webinar a few weeks ago, and he said that certainly in the Australian context, he had come across sharp operators using Zoom as a way of getting round corporate records management policies. People who'd realized that if you set one up, you could actually go into the dark bit at the back and reconfigure things so as to avoid the normal controls. But I just mentioned it.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean that's about circumventing the systems, and that is a worry, that is a concern, I'm sure. I know that IRMS are doing another webinar event, I think on the 3rd of September, about Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and licensing. So I would recommend, if that's something you're interested in, to tune in for that as well. Vibka's made a comment there, Frank. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that, about the meetings of council committees being stood down.
Yeah, I thought that is an interesting one, Vibka. I'll be intrigued to hear your conclusions on that. And yeah, I think in that sort of situation, you effectively have got officers making decisions in lieu of ordinary committee structures and board meetings. So whether it's a new record series or whether it's a sort of continuation effectively of committee meetings and what have you, but we could discuss. But yeah, I'll be fascinated to hear what you've come up with in that, Vibka, if that is something we have to reflect, that use of delegated authorities in a way that's not going to be documented in existing minutes series.
I think it's quite interesting from an archival point of view as well, because what we're talking about here, it's not just the new things that are happening, but of course all of the old things that, as Vika says, a lot of the pre-existing things stopped happening as often. So from the point of view of keeping a record of how organisations function at this time, it's actually really important to think about what isn't happening as well.
That's another interesting point Louise has raised there about how keeping Zoom as a permanent record, how will that impact on what people discuss and how it is used? Maybe picking up a bit on what Alistair was saying there as well. You know, back when freedom of information was introduced, there was a concern that people would circumvent things by not minuting, not documenting, and I know that in the post-legislative scrutiny of FOISA that took place this summer, there was an extended discussion and a recommendation indeed that legislation be made that would require public organisations to have a duty to document, and that's just a recommendation at this point, but it's interesting how that can be managed or not managed with different technologies.
Yeah, and there's some important general points about the use of video, which would exist regardless of Yeah, they're not really COVID issues, but they've been brought to the fore by the rapid deployment of Microsoft Teams and other technologies without governance. And certainly I don't know all the answers to Kay's questions, because personally I wouldn't touch Zoom with a barge pole. Certainly from a Microsoft Teams point of view, while the videos are captured within your Office 365 tenancy, that as I understand it, they're actually sitting within a separate app. I think it's Stream is the video app within the Microsoft 365 environment. So you can manage them there, but Stream doesn't really lend itself to the governance rules. You can't apply retention labels, as far as I understand it, the way you can in SharePoint and 365 and OneDrive and other parts of the 365 environment. Couldn't swear to that. That's worth checking. But certainly the videos are accessible. Actually having governance around them is a trickier element. Touching on the points Louise makes around consent, I'm switching hats here. From a GDPR point of view, I think you really struggle with consent for recording meetings a great deal of the time, particularly if they're staff members. Don't want to bore you with a GDPR course, but consent has to be freely given. Well, can it be freely given by colleagues who need to engage with your organisation? I think transparency is a bigger issue, but also organisations who have gone down the route of using the recording function within Teams or whatever, rather than taking minutes, I might think they're having taken a smart shortcut and saving themselves the bother of writing up minutes. They're actually creating the real world for their own back, as I'm sure everybody in this call can see, in terms of subject access requests, FOISA, being able to access those records. So yeah, I think that's one element where the technology running ahead of the governance is creating some real record keeping problems.
The governance is the issue, isn't it? There's obviously the creation of a lot of information at the moment in different platforms and channels, but it's about exactly that point, about the governance around that, about the management and the access and the control of that is a concern, I think. Rosie's just put in a great big long comment that I haven't had a chance to read, but thank you, Rosie, about the use of information in Zoom and Skype accounts, and who has access to that, who owns it. I'm kind of conscious of the time as well. I know that everyone here's all very busy people, and you've probably got other things you need to be getting on with this afternoon. But before we kind of wrap this up, is there any other question that hasn't been asked this afternoon, or any source of discussion or topic that you think we've not really engaged with? We're really keen to know about that. Thanks, Rosie. If you have anything that you would wish to bring to this conversation, would really welcome that, again, either through the chat or just by raising your hand. From my point of view, I think it's been really interesting this afternoon to get this conversation started. We need to do a bit of analysis over the feedback that you've given us today and the comments here, and myself, Frank, Laura and our colleagues at SCA will look at that over the coming days, and we'll share that with you all, and we'll have a think about what maybe the next action is, and share that again. Louise has asked, is anyone recommending a longer retention to a more routine record that they may normally suggest be destroyed, since the record in question is around COVID? Frank, that was something that you brought up already, actually, about the need to actually just adapt existing retention schedules to change it to reflect the importance.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's precisely one of the key questions that Louise flags there. So I guess I'd be careful to differentiate between an overall change to the retention period, So we're retaining it longer, or the whole record series longer or permanently? Or are we saying, insofar as these records are dealing with a response to COVID, we are going to preserve them permanently, which we wouldn't usually for that record series? So in other words, are we making that part of our archival appraisal criteria, rather than changing the whole retention period? So yeah, I'd be interested if anyone has done that with their own retention schedules. Do please let us know. Be interesting to see specific examples.
Well, Laura, I think the change you'd spoken about at the start about NRS's own selection policy probably falls into that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think so. I think in changing that, we are foreseeing that there may well be different kinds of records that now we might want to suggest have a longer retention on them. In answering Louisa's question specifically, I'm thinking one example from the Scottish Ambulance Service at the moment, where there are kind of records that they take, which normally they don't keep for a particularly long point of time because the record becomes part of the hospital record. But now, because of the kind of importance of thinking about COVID-19 symptoms, some of these kind of initial ambulance call out records might now be considered for longer retention. So it's a very interesting point for us as to whether these then become something that in the fullness of time we think does warrant permanent preservation. But certainly some organisations are considering longer retention to give themselves a bit of a chance to work out if these need to be reviewed at a slightly later date than they would normally be.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I'm sure that will be common to lots of frontline services.
Thanks, Louise.
So, well, perhaps we should maybe think about wrapping this up there for today, unless there is anything else that anyone wants to, shout at us. But we can stay on this, we'll stay on Teams for another few minutes at the end of this if anybody does want to say anything. But thank you, Laura, and thank you, Frank, for your presentations today. They're really interesting and really good food for thought for giving more consideration to this topic, and I think there's some things for us all to pick up on after this. Really interesting, and again, thank you all for your contributions through the Mentimeter. It's the first time that I've been using that. I thought it was pretty cool. Might use it again. And yeah, thank you all, and we'll communicate what the next steps are with you all in the near future. And I believe that Robert is going to make the recording of this available to everybody who took part. Robert, shout at me if that's wrong. And certainly we can share the slides with all the participants here. That would be great. So yeah, thank you everybody for taking part in this today. Thank you.